Check, check. Check, check. Okay. Okay. I know we're having a lot of fun, but we're also late. So if we can settle down a bit. Hello, everyone. Bonsoir. I didn't hear it. Bonsoir. That's better. Thank you. So Aldo, I think we can fade out the music now. Thanks. So my name is Noshir Contractor, and I am the president-elect, kinda, in that subliminal space between president-elect and president of the International Communication Association. Thank you. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this august space for our closing plenary session. And I'm going to hand over over to the chair of the session in a minute, but just to take a couple of minutes to do some acknowledgements and also to frame the import of the place that you're in right now. So this very room that you're in right now has had many, many very memorable and notable events in the past. Those events included Louis Pasteur's 70th birthday celebration and a celebration of his life that happened in this room and had several prominent scientists at the time, including the British surgeon Joseph Lister, who attended it. On the 16th of June in 1894, the first modern Olympics was declared open in this grand amphitheater of the Sorbonne University. So it was Pierre Coubertin first announced what was called as the Olympic Congress. And then in 1946, 20th November, the first General Conference of UNESCO opened in this room in Paris. The inaugural session was held in the same amphitheater that we're looking at. And now those three important events are going to be joined by a fourth memorable event, and which you are going to be, you have a chance to witness in the same grand amphitheater. I want to mention a few thank yous to acknowledge why we were able to come here in the first place. And a lot of that credit goes to one of our conference local co-organizers, Danielle Reichwag, who's also the honorary president of the French Society of Communication Sciences. Danielle. Thank you, Danielle. And Danielle actually is going to tell us a little more than my Cliff Notes version of the Sorbonne during the closing ceremony. So he has prepared some remarks that he will share with us as part of the closing ceremony to go along with our champagne toast and so on. So that's something I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge it. This is such a special opportunity to be in this memorable place. I was just talking to people who've been to Paris many times, never had a chance to get into this particular location. I also want to thank Natalie Mulberry, who is probably not in the room right now, but she's the one who has been organizing this event and has worked very closely with the ICA staff, has worked closely with me in making it possible for us to do all the arrangements, the logistics of both this meeting here today, as well as shortly thereafter, after the session is over, when we go up for the closing farewell toast for this conference. Back there Our two wonder kids who are working, Maxime Klotz and Antoine Gemet are the folks who are back there in the studio. They're the ones who make all the magic possible so that not only do we have great acoustics in the room, but we also are streaming live on Zoom as a webinar and streaming live on YouTube. So we will potentially be getting questions and comments from both those spaces as well. I'm going to hold off to talk about some of our own tech squad volunteers, because you know that that's something that has been a current theme throughout the ICA conference. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to the chair of this closing plenary, Brooke Foucault-Wells, as well as her panelists. So let's give it up for.
Hello. Hi, ICA. Welcome to this incredible venue. Wow. It's amazing to see you all here tonight. It is really, truly a privilege to be here hosting this closing panel at the end of this incredible conference. As Nash mentioned, my name is Brooke Foucault-Wells. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Network Science at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. It is really my honor to be here hosting this closing plenary where we interrogate the idea of one world wide web, one network. Throughout the conference, our theme this year invited us to reflect on how communication, media, and technology unite and divide us. Nowhere is that more apparent than on the World Wide Web, which at the same time promises to connect people around the world in shared communication, and also seems to increasingly divide us into insular and at times hostile fractions. So what does it mean to have one world, one network? How would we achieve that? Have we ever had it? And do we even want it? Those are the questions we'll ponder today. And of course, I'm joined here tonight by an incredible set of scholars who are going to help us think through these ideas. First, we have Professor Dame Wendy Hall. She's the Regis Professor of Computer Science, Associate Vice President of International Engagement, and is the Executive Director of the Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton. Welcome, Wendy. Next, Professor Dean Freelon is an Associate Professor at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina, and is a Principal Researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, or CTAP. Welcome, Dean. And finally, Professor Jeff Hancock is the founding director of the Stanford Social Media Lab and is a professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford University. Welcome, Jeff. So, to get us started, I wanted to invite each of you to reflect on the conference theme. Is there one world, one network? Wendy, why don't you get us started?
Oh, they're on. They're on. Hello. Hello, Paris. I'm trying to tweet because I just see Pascal up there. And as a computer scientist, Pascal is someone who I've often referred to. And I wonder what he would have made of all this World Wide Web. Probably quite a lot, actually. How long have I got? Hours? So I want to tell you a story. If you want more, you can read in my new book, which is called Four Internets. And I want to tell you why Kieran O'Hara and I thought there were 4 networks and try and make it as short as I can, because this is my answer to the one world, one network. I think if you don't know me, I've been around the web before it was the web. I first met Tim at a hypertext conference, Tim Berners-Lee, before he'd put the first website up, and we were developing a hypermedia system called Microcosm, which I thought was much better than the web. But that's another story, which I can tell you another time. But we've been working together, ever since. And when we were around at the beginning of the web, everyone just assumed it was going to be used for the good. It was like, why would anyone want to do anything bad with this? It's so amazing. Although actually, for the first 10 years of the web, nobody really knew much about it. I mean, we have to remember, we were talking about this earlier, that, Facebook only started 15 years ago. Right? The web started 30 years ago. This is all very recent history. And things happen almost before we know, they happen before we know they're going to happen. It's sort of like, well, we know things are going wrong, and how do we fix it? And when Kieran and I started looking at this issue, it became obvious to us retrospectively, there was never going to be one network in the sense that we might want it, in that everything behaves like we might want it to behave. And just to very quickly sum up why we've written a book called Four Internets. In that book, we talk about the first internet being the one that was developed by the internet pioneers in the 1970s that we all used when we went into COVID. We all jumped onto the internet to talk to each other, to talk to our friends, to stay sane, to get onto TikTok, whatever you were doing, to send money, whatever you were doing, you could do that. And it stayed up and running, and that's testament to the pioneers in the 70s who designed something that the whole world could jump onto. And so that's still there. The open standards, we call it the Silicon Valley Internet, is still running. The technical backbone of the internet is still there. And if that goes, then we really do not have one network. And it is under threat. But the other three internets we talk about are cultural or geopolitical internets. And there could be many, many more. Because we're not all the same. We do not all have the same values, either as individuals or as nation states or as areas of the world. And we summarize this. The other three in this way, the other three internets we talk about are rolling around the world. First of all, in the US, where a lot of you are from, we call this the commercial internet, because that's where the big companies are that lobby Washington for the tax reliefs and the laws that they want to run by to make money for their shareholders. Nothing wrong with that. But it's a driver that's very different to much of the rest of the world. Now, here in Europe, and the UK is still part of Europe, just in case you'd worried, we may be in a different political community now, but we're still an island off the coast of Europe. The whole of Europe, really, because we think our value has been very much up until now data protection led. So GDPR came from the heart of Europe and is still the law under which we run. And if you want to do anything digitally with anyone in any country in Europe, you have to abide by that data. And that's a very different way to think about the internet, and potentially is both a liberation for people because they know that they're protected, but also it's stifling sometimes, people say, of innovation because there are all sorts of constraints to it you have to worry about. And the fourth internet we talk about is, as you keep rolling around the world, the very dominant Chinese internet, which none of us look at mostly because most of us, it's someone in the front row who's completely different. Most of us can't speak Chinese, so we don't ever see it. But that's a much, from the very get-go, the Chinese government realized that this internet thing and this web was a way to both disseminate information to citizens and to control citizens. And they have been very upfront about what they do in terms of the way they run the internet in that part of the world. And these are three major cultures. There are a lot of others, and I know I've got to finish soon, or I'll hog the whole stage. But we also talk in the book, and it was very prescient of the way the world is developing this year. We talk about, well, what about Russia in all this? Well, Russia's a tiny country. But we call it the spoiler, because the Russian aim is to hack and stir things up and make things difficult for the people they don't agree with. So we don't give them the credit of being an internet, but they're definitely trying to spoil it for everybody else. And also in the book, we talk about India. Now, India's 1.4 billion people nearly. It's huge in terms of numbers. And we call India the swing state, because depending on which way India goes in terms of how it controls or doesn't or uses freedom of speech on the internet will determine very much the future, because, and this is the point I'm going to finish on, we are about at the point where nearly 60% of the world is on the internet, has access to the internet. Now that's in about, since Tim put the first website up in December 1990, that's 32 years, and that's a pretty good going, right? Infrastructure-wise, we've got over half the world on the internet. That means that there's another 40-something% of the world to come onto the internet. And most of those people will be in rural China, rural Africa, and rural India. Now, we know that which way China was going and all this. China is deeply influencing how the internet is being used in Africa. And if India, which is making huge strides in terms of digital identities, with its Aadhaar number, which can be used both for good and bad, if India went a way that was against our cultural values, then we could end up with an internet in 20 years' time, the majority of which it does not respect the sort of cultural values we have in the West. That's the picture we paint in the book. So we don't have one world, one network, and we need to appreciate it's not just about the technology, it's deep, it's cultural, it's geopolitical, it's all about our values and where they land. And one last thing, it is ours. Nobody owns the internet. No company, no country at the moment, no nation state owns the internet. It is, if we want to use it for the good, it is as much up to us to protect it as to anybody else.
These things come on. Great. Okay, so is there one world, one internet? Well, I have two answers to this. One is sort of boring and shallow, and another is a little bit interesting. So let me start with the boring one. The boring answer is yes, in that we can email people from all over the world. We can access websites that are hosted all over the world. We can communicate in ways that were impossible prior to Tim Berners-Lee's introduction of the web, the introduction of the internet in the 60s and 70s. And so there is a sense in which oneness is generated through the technological interoperability and standards that weave together everything we understand and know as the web and the internet. So yeah, the potential is certainly there. That's the boring answer. More interesting answer is no, because we look around and it is as though we live in worlds apart, right? And all the differences that separate us, I mean, in the US context, which is the one with which I'm most familiar, all those differences, I think, become manifest on the internet that we see and use every day, right? So if you think about just the US case, you know, we can't agree on who won the election, right? We can't agree on whether COVID is a real threat, let alone, you know, whether it exists in the first place, right? Those of you who went to ICA, you look around the lobby, we can't agree on whether, you know, to wear masks in the lobby inside of a building. You know, and we can't agree as a discipline, even within the discipline of communication, we can't agree on what is important and what's not, right? And so, and again, all these differences are reflected in the networks that we use every day. And so I'm going to give a little preview in terms of the normative questions that we're going to explore later. This question of, so there's a description, there's sort of a descriptive side of this, right? Are we one network or not? And then there is the normative question of, should we be one internet or not? Which I think is an entirely separate question, which I think we should explore, and I think we will. And the last point I'm going to say about this is, you know, when I first heard of this one world, one internet, I kept thinking about these sort of commercials from the 1990s. Those of you who are old enough will remember this, right? So all these commercials that were trying to introduce the idea of what the internet actually was. So AOL had some of these, AT&T had some of them, and it put this very, you know, positive, almost utopian spin on the kind of 1960s Marshall McLuhan global village idea. But those of us who are steeped in the communication research tradition will understand the concept of a frame, right? We all know what frames are. And that's a frame. But understanding the existence of frames also hips you to the idea that there are alternative frames. And so an alternative frame to this very positive view of oneness and of one world, one internet is that of monopoly, right? So the idea that one person, one very small group of people may control the one world, one internet if it actually exists. And that doesn't really resonate well with me. But I think that people who think about one world, one internet, it strikes me that your opinion of that may well depend on whether you consider yourself or whether you are one of the small group of people who are actually running the show, or whether you're outside banging on the doors trying to get in. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dean, and thank you for having us. It's a real honor to be on a panel with everybody here. In fact, Brooke was the student that picked me up at my very first job interview at Cornell University, took me to my talk and all around, and I got the job. So basically I owe this to Brooke, the whole everything. Thank you so much. Wendy has Pascal, a computer scientist, to look upon. I'm gazing upon Descartes here, who was really influential for me as a psychologist growing up. He was influential on all of psychology. He was very focused on the individual level, trying to think about the mind and the soul, coming to the conclusion, I think, therefore I am. And I'm really grateful to be in the field of communication, because I've come to realize as a psychologist I was wrong, and that's wrong. I communicate in a network, therefore I am, has become very obvious to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. I've been working on that all day. And so in my response to this is that it's become clear that I also was wrong for a long time in a lot of my research, where I, as a psychologist, was interested in how people use technology within networks to communicate with each other, to be social. And I would do things like, oh, when I saw this in an experiment, I would conclude this is how this happens with people. This is the way technology affects people. This is the way that people use technology. And it's become really clear at this conference, but also over the last 5 or 6 years, all the great work by the students in my lab, that we're not all the same, obviously. And I think our field is coming to this, where if you're, say, being exposed to disinformation and you're in a Latinx community in the US versus you're in Ukraine right now, or in Russia, you're in really radically different networks. And the kinds of things that we understand in communication are going to differ a lot based on what community you're in. Or another one, we've been looking a lot at disinformation, and it turns out that older folks are exposed way more to disinformation, like 7 times more than, say, young people. And yet we sort of talk about disinformation in general as if it affects all of us the exact same, which does a couple things. It freaks out people that are, say, younger, that maybe aren't getting exposed as much. And it prevents resources to getting to the older folks, say, that need more of that support and help. So I think certainly for me and the kind of research that I do, the more I break down that mindset of one people, one network, one experience of technology, I think the better we're going to be able to both understand and advance our science, but also help people and provide interventions for folks that need it. So thank you.
Thank you. From computer science and psychology, it strikes me that often, although we're communication scholars here at a communication conference, we draw on adjacent disciplines in order to reason about questions in our discipline about the one world and the one network. So I wonder if you might elaborate that a little bit for us. So where do you draw insights, theory, methods? What are the adjacent disciplines that are shaping the way you think about this space?
I'll start from this side. We'll go back maybe. Yeah. So you would think I would draw on psychology mostly, but I think looking back, computer science has been really inspirational for me, in part because I found that the computer science folks that I work with, both at Stanford and at Cornell, were really interested in developing systems that would work well for whatever the group was they were working with. And I felt like they were really different than psychologists, where we were looking for the big one theory that fit everything. So example would be, social identity theory, it's going to apply to people everywhere at all times, depending on your identity. Computer scientists were like, no, that's fine, but we're going to build this model because it works really well over here, but it's just that model. And we're happy to build another model that will work over here. It's this idea of developing different ideas and models that are appropriate for a particular circumstance, rather than trying to come up with the grand empire theory. I've been really influenced by that, a sort of a humility around that I really appreciated.
Going back across? Sure, great. So when I was a graduate student, what I perceived as the zeitgeist of political communication was theory that was sort of totalizing and all-encompassing. So you wanted these very, very general theories that applied as widely as it possibly could go. And there wasn't really a whole lot of talk or conversation about some of the differences that condition how we communicate most intimately. But that simply the communication discipline, at least political communication, really did not discuss very much at all. And so there was very little discussion, at least in that area of communication, of some of the differences that all of us recognize instantly, those of race, of gender, even ideology wasn't discussed that much, or partisanship, perhaps more in political science, less so in political communication, but certainly more than race and gender. Religion, LGBTQ identity, those sorts of things. There were two events that really changed my entire outlook on this. The first was the rise of Black Lives Matter in 2014 in the United States. The second was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And I think that really changed a lot of people's thinking on the importance of identity. These are questions to which many Americans already knew the answer, people with opinions very, very different from mine, and I assume many of yours, people with opinions rather, that are, to put it bluntly, quite racist and quite sexist. And so they were quite aware of this. These are people that perhaps we don't talk to as much as we should. And so when I think about work that really influenced me to make this turn in my research, there are a couple of specific names and research traditions that come to mind. I think about one paper in particular that was published in 1996 in the journal Public Opinion Quarterly by the political scientist Martin Gylens, which was a content analysis. And if you know POQ, you know they publish very few content analyses. And so this was a content analysis of the portrayal of Black Americans in print news media as sort of avatars of poverty, and how the news media really misrepresented the extent to which sort of able-bodied, unemployed Black Americans were the face of poverty relative to their prevalence in the general population. So that was a big one. I'm also very much influenced by Travis Dixon's work, which applied some of the same ideas and theories to Black and other racial categories representation in the news media, again, as agents of crime and of social pathology. More recently, I look to studies like the 2018 study Communication So White, which was published in the Journal of Communication by Paula Chakravarty and colleagues, and of course the more recently excellent and award-winning #activism by Sarah Jackson, Wyatt Bailey, and our very own Brooke Foucault-Wells, which is an excellent synthesis of critical theory that's very, very attentive to identity with some very cutting-edge computational methods. And so I don't know whether those congeal into any kind of, field or school of thought, but so those are some of the studies and people that have really influenced my thinking recently.
Thank you, Dean. I'll slip you a 20 later. Thank you for that. Wendy, please.
What's content analysis?
Looking at things and, oh gosh, I'm terrible at doing this quickly. I'll tell you after we're done.
Oh, okay.
Sort of counting what's in.
I didn't know what you meant by that. And I also, with Jeff, you said something about humility. I've never met a humble computer scientist.
Yeah, I know it's not usually used for computer scientists, so I just want to throw that out there for you.
Computer scientists think they rule the world. Right? That is and I learned, so let's go back a little bit. So, computer scientists think they built the internet and the World Wide Web without people being involved at all, right? What do you need people for, right? This stuff, and the revelation that Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Chabot and I had, and with Danny White, so you met Tim and Nigel on the first panel, back in 2004-05. We three are computer scientists, geeky people, I suppose. I'm not, but you know. Yeah. Well, actually, to be fair, Nigel's a philosopher and a psychologist, but he's more geeky than I am. But and Danny Weitzer was at MIT with Tim, and he's a lawyer. And the four of us, we were trying to work out why the semantic web, which, you know, RDF, a lot of angle bracket stuff, linked data, why people weren't just using it, right? Like they'd use the web, and why weren't they just using it? And so we sat around in Tim's office and in various offices in Southampton, and started realizing that actually we had to think about people as well as technology. Right? This was a huge eye-opener for us. And it really was a bit of a revelation. And that's what became what we called web science, for good or bad, which is it was trying to get computer scientists together with sociologists, psychologists, political scientists, management scientists, business people to talk about this ecosystem that we called, what Tim called the World Wide Web, and from a socio-technical point of view. It's very hard to do that. Now, I'm intrigued by this conference because it seems to me very, very interdisciplinary at its heart. I don't know if you all agree with that or not. There's a lot of people here from different disciplines. How many computer scientists here? Very small.
Look how humble they are. They're in the back too.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. Well, probably in the bar. So dragging computer scientists to a conference like this, you'd have to drag them kicking and screaming, and dragging social scientists, psychologists to any non-computer science subject to a computer science conference. It really is kicking and screaming. And one of the big cultural differences is that we publish some of our best papers at conferences, which is totally against. I mean, I guess in all the papers you talked about are in very good journals that you rate because of, the academic world has always hated computer scientists because our best papers go to the top computer conferences, which you guys don't want to know about at all. So you don't want to come and give your best work at a conference. But if we start a journal, the computer scientists aren't going to want to publish in it. Right. So this is just a very simple difference of cultures that comes together that means we don't get, it's really difficult to try it, but you can do it. The other story I'll tell is that when we started encouraging, we got some money from our UK government to have web science PhD students, start a whole cohort of PhD students. So we started to, and the idea was they could come from any discipline and they would have to study. They had to have advisors. I think you call, in the US, you call them advisors, supervisors from different faculties, different disciplines. That was the rule for this cohort. And so a computer scientist came to work with my friend Susan Halford, who's a sociologist. Some of you might know her here. She's now at Bristol. She was at Southampton then. And it was really on how it was her stuff on workflows, but how did organizations adapt to new technologies like the World Wide Web? That was the basic thesis. So as a computer scientist, let's build something and take it to an organization and test it. That's what we do. We build things. I'm an engineer. Remember, computer science is actually an engineering subject as well as, it's probably more an engineering subject than a science. And I like to just go build things and test them, right? Which is what happened actually with the World Wide Web. It was a huge worldwide experiment, but the trouble is we can't undo it, that one, right? We can't just undo and start again. We have to fix. But so I wanted to build something, and Susan said to me, no, he's got to learn Bourdieu's theory first. Am I pronouncing it right? Like, what? And he did. He did. He learned it, and then we tried it out in some case studies, and he got a PhD out of the results. And good on him, right? But that is really hard to ask someone to do. There are easier ways to get an interdisciplinary PhD, but there's a clash of cultures sometimes that make it really hard.
For sure. So Wendy, you just alluded to this. We have this World Wide Web, and we can't get rid of it. maybe we can, but we maybe can't get rid of it. Given the divisiveness we see online and given the challenges, we could enumerate many, I won't spare you. Do we want to carry on with this idea of becoming one World Wide Web? Or do we want to set it aside, move on to something else, do something different, change the whole thing, or get rid of it altogether?
Well, I think it's neither. Getting rid of it would mean, I think, wasn't that the first panel, but I think Tim said something like, well, what would you put in its place? I mean, when we, as I said, when the big example when we went into the lockdowns with COVID is what kept a lot of us sane. It drove some people mad as well, being on the internet all the time. But we were able to survive and live and trade and talk to our families and buy things, and watch videos on Netflix or TikTok, whatever your favorite torture is, because of this thing that we had. For all its faults, it kept us going. And, when you think about how this war is being fought in Europe, the internet's playing a huge role in terms of intelligence on both sides, providing people with help. Even Elon Musk and his satellites have really helped a lot in that. There's all sorts of things where the technology is being used for the good, but of course it has gone very toxic in many different ways, which I don't have to rehearse. You know that better than I do. So I think that, in terms of fixing it, can I talk about Web3 now? All right, so we rehearsed a little bit about what we were going to say. I want to look to the future because Tim's, I don't know if he talked much about Solid in the panel, but that's I think his main mission at the moment is he wants to re-decentralize, take the power away from the big corporates, and empower people to take ownership of their own data. And how you do this in China, I have no idea, which is a third of the internet. But anyway, that was the piece of the issue I made at the beginning. But in terms of what we want to do with it, with our values in democracies and where we value freedom of speech, is to re-decentralize the web, because it was originally a very decentralized environment, and to give and in Solid you put your data in a pod, and then somebody manages the interface between your pod and whatever you want to trade, whoever you want to trade your data with. I won't go into the detail, you could ask. Now that's Solid, and there's he's taking that forward, and the man's a genius, so he could fix it if he get the ecosystem around it. But there's this huge inertia with the big companies. The last thing they want is the web to be re-decentralized, because they make money out of us giving them our data. So that's, but now we've also got this, I think that there's a major disruptor coming called Web3. And you need to differentiate between Web 3.0 and Web 3. Now, confusingly, Web 2.0 was where we got into the social networks. Sorry, I hope you heard. So when we were trying to build the semantic, I say we, this is the royal we, when the techie world was trying to get people to use linked data, semantic web, that was called Web 3.0. That was going to be the big revolution. And in fact, that's the heart of Solid. Solid is social linked data. But that was Web 3.0. There is now there's a meme around, which is now landing as Web 3 without a space. And you have to understand that is a complete buzzword. It's hype. If anyone tells you they've got a Web 3 system, it's hype at the moment. But there are a lot of people, good and bad, people who want to make money and people who want to do good for the world, who are building Web 3 architectures. And the key to the way you know a Web 3 play is if it's using blockchain and has a cryptocurrency play, and potentially comes out of the games field and is potentially heading towards the metaverse. But it's still any Web 3 play will be about giving you your data back in a pod or a vault or a wallet, or the idea is that we will all manage our own data, and some sort of agency or trust or company, heaven forbid, will manage the relationship between our data and the rest of the world. That's coming, and I think it is the only way to fix it, right? I think this is the only way to go. What we have to make sure is that we don't repeat the mistakes of the first web and let that all go to hell in a handcart in a way we don't want, right?
Oh, that's true.
So it is so important that I personally would put my vote with Tim Berners-Lee, but those two worlds that I've described, this solid world and the Web3 world, don't seem to be talking, because Tim's not using blockchain. He's, that's not the way he wants to go. So there is a new world coming, but I think it's beholden on communities like yourselves to think about, well, what's our idea? How do we want this new world to operate? Can we play a part in that? So it isn't just led by the techies who want to make money out of cryptocurrencies and metaverses.
Let's hope so. Huh? Jeff, it looks like you have something to say.
I do. I'm really excited about a lot of the Web3 aspects, especially NFTs and the way they're allowing people to own their sort of own self-expression, etc.
No.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, I mean, should you buy some bathing ape? No, that doesn't seem like a good idea. And it seems kind of like a lot of money laundering. And
Own self-expression, what does that mean?
bathing ape?
Huh?
But which did you?
No, what does own self-expression mean?
Own your own self-expression. So as simple as like, if I post something on the internet, say on Instagram, if I mint that as an NFT, I now have ownership of that, right? So I can say that is something that belongs to me. It doesn't belong, say, to Instagram or Meta. And so I think there's an opportunity here as a way to take back control. But the worry that I have about Web3 and a lot of the hype that comes out of it, I think, as you're alluding to, is it's not clear what the problem is that it's trying to solve. So listening a lot at the conference here, I frankly think the biggest problem to solve for most people that are using technologies is a sense of a lack of agency. People just don't feel like they're in control of their media, of their technology, of their finances, that the large companies, I think, algorithms, everything else is sort of out of their control. And so I think if that's a problem, right, this lack of agency, and to the degree to which Web3 technologies like blockchain related things, I don't know what Solid is like. If those can help solve those sort of human problems, then I think, we're on the right track. But if it's just, as you say, another way to, make a bunch of money for some people in my neighborhood, then I'm not very excited.
Yeah, and it is between those at the moment. It's not just that people I think they don't care actually, because most people don't understand any of this. And they just go where the herd is, right?
Well, I think most people are just trying to live their lives, and get through day to day. And it's partly up to our discipline to help figure out what is a good way to make these things happen. And I think that's why a lot of privacy sort of approaches fail, because I don't want to have to tell you which cookies you can, track before every single time I go to a website. Like being here in Europe this week has been so annoying in that one respect.
That's you see, this is the different. This is the third internet we talk about, because it's so bloody annoying.
Yeah, it's super annoying. It's super annoying.
Could somebody please expose it? Was there some recent regulatory change that's behind that? I feel like an idiot, but I don't.
GDPR.
Oh, but it also affects like people in the U.S. So it doesn't matter where you are. You still got to deal with it because Europe changes regulations. So that's pretty sweet.
Network, man. One network.
Okay, well, there it is, right? So
Except in China.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. Well, this question, perplexes me a bit because I still don't know what one world, one network means. And so I'm just going to talk about some stuff that's on my mind, if that's all right. I think that there is an element of oneness or unity that should be preserved in the next iteration of the internet, wherever we happen to be going. And that is, I think, something I alluded to in my first comments, which is the ability to communicate with people across time and space. So, there have been some plans by national governments to lock down their internets in various ways to make them impenetrable to certain types of communication in the name of security, in the name of national identity and the prerogative to control a nation's digital destiny. But I still think it's incredibly convenient, to say the least, useful, perhaps life-changing in some instances, to be able to email someone that you don't know in a different country, to make those kinds of connections, to be able to go to web pages that are hosted in various places, to learn things that you couldn't learn or that would be prohibitively difficult to learn without the web. And so I think that that baseline level of interoperability is something that One World, One Network puts me in mind of, and something that's worth preserving. There's something else that I think is in the same vein, but that we don't have currently, and that is a baseline shared set of what is true and real, so we can have actual conversations between one another about what to do about it. I don't know how we get there, but I think we certainly need it. When we live in a society in which it's easy to create a false reality simply by denying things that are manifestly obvious, like the fact that over 1 million people in my home country are dead because of COVID. And there are some people who just approach that through denial by saying it didn't happen, it's a hoax, when it's that easy. And when you have social support from that comes from the internet, right? A group of people that are like you, so non-elites, as well as a group of elites that are willing to profit off of those types of beliefs, because it turns out that making things up is both easier and more profitable than doing actual news. So it's no surprise that a group of unscrupulous individuals have flocked to that and made it the cottage industry, or more than that. And so I think that if we can get back to that, that would be really nice. I don't know how we do that. It puts me in mind of One World, One Internet, but I really wish I had a better idea of how to get there.
What about anonymity on the internet? That would, because there's a big problem about what's a bot and what's a human. What's a bot, what's a human, and what there's stuff. But there's an issue around being able to verify people's credentials on the internet, even if they can appear anonymous to the readers. That the companies who manage these things have to be able to verify their credentials before they can register.
Well, wasn't that one of the things that Elon Musk said? He said he had all these big plans for verification, like anybody should be able to.
This is a big deal. This is a big part of Web3, and this is a big part of fixing it. So it would. Sorry, I see it from a technical point of view. It's terrible. That's why I'm sitting here, I think. But also, I think from what you're just saying there is that potentially will not solve, but ease some of the problems you're talking about.
Well, maybe, but then some of the biggest mis and disinformation purveyors out there, we know exactly who they are. We know who Alex Jones is, right? We know who.
Can't do anything about that.
Right. We know who Sean Hannity is. We know who Tucker Carlson
censors? Who bans them? I mean, the UK is about to pass. Well, is trying to pass something called the Online Safety Bill, which will put the censorship in the hands of the big companies. Right? It was because it's basically saying if it's illegal, then it's illegal and you can't put it out there. So, but if it's legal but potentially harmful, the big companies have got to decide whether they take it down or not. And I think that makes them our censors, and that's not a way we want to go. That's what, and the UK is sort of following, the EU's doing something, who's from Europe here, it's Digital Economy Act that's just gone through Parliament in Brussels. No one knows more about this than I do, but this will hit you, America, in some way.
Sure.
Differently, just like you have to click on the flipping access all cookies thing.
Oh gosh, yeah. No, I'm not super sanguine about the potential of identity to do that, because people, that's how you create a brand name for yourself, right? You give people what they want to hear. Regardless of whether it's true. In fact, it works a little better if there's a little truth mixed in, so they can't tell the difference between what's false and what's true. And that's your gravy train, right? That's your money making opportunity.
Do you think that's all? Do you think that's all? I mean, the internet amplifies it. We used to have it with newspapers.
But now you don't need any capital investment. You just need a website, right? And you need to be right. You're Joe Rogan, right? Like you're just a guy with a microphone, with half decent production values. You get on there, you're the most popular, person. You're selling, garbage, right, to people, saying things. But you watch your numbers go up, get acquired by Spotify, right? I mean, that's millions of dollars right there. It's no confusion about why folks are trying to hop on that gravy train. You know what I mean?
I'll let Jeff jump in. I happen to know that you've done some work on this anonymity or non-anonymity issue. So what do you think?
Yeah,
Legislation?
this is just like the challenge of our lifetimes. I think. I mean, there's a few other problems like climate change that require a fair bit of work, but this idea of like what is truth and what is anonymity, it's the hardest things that we can study. I just feel we've been studying this as humans since we were able to start talking. This idea of like what is true and how do we come to consensus is not new. It's perhaps been really, radically accelerated here, but I don't think Web3 solves the identity issue. I think, yes, you'll be, that transaction will be tied to a wallet, but that wallet doesn't have to necessarily be tied to me as Jeff Hancock. So I don't think anonymity goes away anywhere. And in fact, maybe there's those two key networks. You have the known network. I know Dean and Wendy and Brooke, and when they contact me, I know who they are and I have a reputational tie. But if there's one thing technologies, especially social networks, have done is allow the unknown network, all the people I don't know, that Russian person, the person advertising to me, they all can get my attention. And so I think that's been the real difference. I don't see Web3 changing it. In terms of like truth, what is truth?
I can see how Web3 can change it technically. I mean, because you have to have verifiable credentials at some point.
The transaction's verified, right? And it's put up on the blockchain, and that is very difficult to change. You should be able to trace that back to whatever entity it was that engaged in that transaction, but it doesn't necessarily connect it to me. So if you want to buy some good, drugs or whatever right now, what's the best way to do it? It'd be crypto, but not necessarily because, right, of all the ID connections, but because it's a way to be anonymous. Certainly with the degree to which law enforcement is skilled in that space right now. Well, maybe cash is the best way still, but cryptocurrencies is really, plays a big part in crime now. So I don't think it's going to solve that problem, but this notion of like what is truth is probably going to be.
You could make it harder for people to do stuff anyway.
Yeah, that's true. You can make it harder. I think, Facebook tried to make it harder too. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I mean, anything that helps us, overcome the distinction between who's Starboy 3629 versus it's a real person. It's Dean who's trying to, say something to me. I would actually prefer we think of it more on the education side, that we adapt to this new space, which is Starboy 3469. I shouldn't care at all what that person has to say. I shouldn't believe them on whether it's truthful. I shouldn't worry about their identity. I should completely ignore them. I think right now, if somebody like that comes into my space and somehow gets in front of me in a comment or a direct message, it's hard for me to ignore them. And so how do we learn to adapt to this new world where we're not constantly triggered by Starboy 3629?
All right. We're going to transition soon to the Q&A portion. I've taken some chair's prerogative because we started late. We'll end a little late. But before we do that, this is the hardest thing for an academic to do. But I wonder if you could reflect in, let's say, 2 minutes on some of the big challenges for the field moving forward in this space. Keeping in mind, we have scholars of all generations, but many, many junior scholars in the audience. So if you were to place some bets about what the hot topics will be in the next 5 years, where should people be investing some effort?
Academically.
Academically, yeah.
Or as an investor in a company.
I mean, if you have tips on that too. Would like that too.
I'll start because I do have a thought on this. So 2 things. Especially if you're a young academic, I do think, and this goes off of Wendy's point about chat bots, or bots in general. I think the 5th network to build on Wendy's is AI. I see AI is talked about in a lot of other disciplines, but not in communication, even though I think communication is the success point for AI so far. There's billions, at least 6 billion messages sent a day written by AI saying, hey, Dean, I can meet you there, right? And all those little smart replies. We now have GPT-3 that can write long messages. It can write your resume. It can do those posts. It can make you look sexy in online dating, all of these sort of things. And yet we're not really studying it. The fact that AI is communicating on our behalf, I think, is really important. I have a student here today, Elise, presented work showing that this one system, GPT-3, with the way she was able to use it, could produce more credible more persuasive pro-vaccine messages than the US's CDC, right? I mean, yeah, it has a lot of potential for harm. I think disinformation, sure, there's going to be, you could have infinite supply, limited only by electricity, but Elise's work shows that it could actually be used to help humans. But we don't know anything about how AI speaking as human affects us humans. How does it change the way we think about ourselves or others? The only other thing, so that's one really important area. The other one, the first panel, at the beginning, the plenary, power was talked about a lot. And it had me thinking a lot about power over the last few days. So I'm just gonna say one other thing that I think is important, and that is we as a discipline have a huge amount of power to shape how society talks about technology. And I worry right now that with that power, we've lost a little responsibility. I think we do a lot of research, or at least the media covers our work, where it points to the power of media and the power of technology, and it removes the agency from people in that equation. Facebook does stuff to us, or that technology does this to kids. And I think it really flips the equation and takes power away from individuals and the people that are there. I'd much rather my daughter feel like she has agency and she has control over what she does, and we teach them how to do that, than to tell her that it's addictive and to just not use it. Because I feel, as Wendy pointed out earlier, that sort of horses out of the barn. So I think we need to think about power and the important power that our discipline has in shaping the narrative.
Yeah, technological determinism is a seductive narrative, which has been sort of laughed out of the social science academy, certainly in communication, but sadly, a lot of the media hasn't really gotten the message. See, what I would say about, I'm going to use this opportunity to advocate rather than to predict. I think that as a discipline, we need to get a handle on identity, principally race and gender, but also age, economic class, and other identity factors, religion, and things of this nature, right? So for a very long time, and to this day, we use identity characteristics as covariates in statistical models and sort of, the less important, variables, which we might talk about a little bit. But identity really conditions so much about how we communicate, right? We communicate with our children differently than with adults. We communicate with men differently than women, different races, different levels of English, of the language that we speak, in my case, English language proficiency, will all condition this. And yet it seems to me that very little communication research tends to focus on this, and that does is relegated to the margins of the discipline. So my hope is that, the rise of Donald Trump and his sort of centering of identity in ways that I perceive as being very negative politically will help inspire communication researchers to think more incisively about identity and how it might come closer to the center of communication research, because I can't think of a single theoretical framework across any of the divisions that doesn't interface with identity at some point. So I certainly would advocate that anyone listening out there who hasn't firmly focused on or settled on what they want their research to be about, and even those of you who have, to consider how identity might affect and impact your own work. Yeah.
I wish I could speak as eloquently as you do. There's all those long words put into sentences that make sense. Amazing. I'm not being, I can't talk like that. I think that I'm going to pick up on the AI piece, but I think I want to tell you a little story before that. So I often, when I'm interviewed about the web, I often talk about, the things that are wrong with it. And the design flaws that in fact we are living with now. But so I'll just tell you a little story that how many of you heard of Ted Nelson? Ted Nelson invented the terms hypertext, hypermedia back in the 60s, 70s. Great friend of mine, and also someone I've learned a lot from, a mentor, a huge maverick, big chip on his shoulder. That he designed a system called Xanadu, and you can read all about it. I mean, and he says people say to him, "Well, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. That's Xanadu." He says, "No, it's not." Somebody, and I'll just tell you two things that were in Xanadu that are not in the web. And he says, "Two cheers to Tim," right? Because it's not. And Ted Nelson's fatal flaw was he didn't get what Tim did. That was is that he gave the web away. That was what Tim did. And CERN, to be fair to CERN, where he invented it, he gave it away to the world. They could have charged for it, and it was that really, and the other things like Mosaic and the Apache servers and that made the web take off. There was another system at the time called what was it, Gopher? No, something else at the time, which was they started to charge for, and people stopped using it. But the thing about what TED did was and the hypertext community were following this. In TED's Xanadu system, links were bidirectional. Now that would have sorted out a lot of problems. In the web, they were unidirectional, so you didn't necessarily know where you had come from or where the link had come from. And in Xanadu, they were bidirectional. The other thing that TED had in Xanadu was transclusions. And without going into the real technical definition of it, it basically says, if I copy something from somewhere else, then I know where it's come from. And I put that into my system, and there's a link back to where it came from. And he argued for micropayments, and he said, if I take something from someone else, I'll give them a bit of $1 for it, right? Just like we do with our mobile phones. And that could have stopped the whole industry developing as it has. But but on the other hand, the web might not have become as ubiquitous as it is under TED's design. And I find that really interesting in terms of how do we think about that lesson from history and the balance between the two different designs and what we're going to do going forward. So I don't have an answer to that, but I try all the time to think about what have I learned about living in 3D worlds, about NFTs of my self-expression. Anyway, I haven't understood that one yet. But the other thing I just want to pick up on what you said, Jeff, about AI, because we do talk about it in the book, not. I am at Southampton and other places are only doing it at Stanford. Human-centered AI is becoming a big thing. Yeah. And I think that's, if I was new disciplines for PhD studies, I would go human-centered AI. I don't know if you're an advocate of Ben Schneiderman, he's just got a new book out on it, but you've got the lab, we're doing it at Southampton. There's many places around the world where taking this approach, and what you said about GPT-3 and all that, it's that, how do we keep the human in the loop? How do we make sure it works for human beings? Right. Because the AI folks, the computer scientists doing this will just keep on building systems.
It's like when you were just thinking about making the web without people. We need to make sure we have the people in there.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the way I go for new discipline.
Great. All right. It's your turn. So if you have a question, my former advisor and our president-elect is going to scurry around with the microphone. So shoot your hand up. We have time to take a few questions tonight.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Łukasz. I'm from the University of Sheffield. And I would like to, in my question, circle back to the first plenary session and specifically thinking about and asking the questions about the two new visions for the internet that Professor Hall was talking about, Solid and Web3, that I don't know much about. But we heard some provocations in the first plenary sessions about that. And the one provocation was that part of the problem with those new technologies very often is that we create those technologies first and we don't think too much about what will be the results and how they will be used. And another provocation was also there that we should probably think about the potential costs of those new technologies. And in that spirit, I wanted to ask, if in those two models that are now being thought about, Solid and Web3, what kind of costs are being thought about? Specifically, one example could be what kind of infrastructure they need, what kind of resources need to be extracted for those new technologies. You've mentioned that one of them is based on blockchain. That takes a lot of energy. So what will be the environmental cost of those new technologies, and is it really discussed already by thinking and designing those new technologies? Thank you.
It's very hard to hear you. Sorry, I hope you've been able to hear us because the acoustics are quite interesting here.
Something about the costs of solid and Web3, right? So thinking about the introduction, of new technologies and how we don't think about the costs sometimes when we introduce those. That's an accurate paraphrase.
Yeah, I mean, right. Yeah. So I think like many industries, the environmental sort of externalities come really late. And I think we're about to experience them in the communication technology space. So with Web3 as an example, yeah, it can be really intense. Things like Ethereum and Coinbase are really intense. But I think there's a lot of movement now in the crypto space, certainly to move off chain a little bit, so that they're not, when you're minting things, it's not on a public chain right off the bat. So I think there's ways of lowering what are called these gas fees. So I think that's a relatively solvable problem. But bigger picture, I think you're trying to get at is, what are the costs of all these things that we're doing? So I believe that a single Google search is like the equivalent of heating a cup of tea, if I remember reading that correctly. And so that was really mind-blowing for me. I think we haven't really got to that. That said, flying my body here from California also comes with substantial costs and substantial benefits. I've seen old friends and students that I haven't seen in far too long. So I like the idea here of us thinking a little bit more that just because it happens online doesn't mean it doesn't have a cost.
I think, yeah, so other people can raise their hands while I'm talking. I think that the question of cost is a difficult one to answer for new technologies, because if you look at the history of technology, technological creators and humans more generally, commentators, anyone who's paying attention, have a really bad track record at predicting exactly how technologies will be used and exactly what kinds of costs will be major and which kinds will be minor, right? So my wife, who's in the audience, recently reminded me that YouTube initially was used as sort of a video dating service kind of thing, that people were sort of to record their profiles and things like this and to have people respond to them. Clearly didn't go anywhere, right? And so YouTube right now, as we see it, is used quite differently, right? Twitter's another good example of this, where innovations like hashtags and retweeting were not part of the original plan and were introduced by users. And so I think also some of the mis and disinformation that we're seeing now were not predicted by the originators of the web or social media. So I think that's a very, very hard question to figure out. The environmental one, I think, is obviously one we're going to have to deal with. But some of the other costs, I think, are really going to be emergent and ones that we're going to have to watch out for as they arise.
Thank you so much for the great discussion. One of the things that I've always liked about the web is its multilingual nature. The fact that one of the great things about it is the languages. And I'm reminded, perhaps, the reference to UNESCO before of the McBride report, Many Voices, One World, which I think is a good way to think about the theme. So my question is about, to what extent have we got many voices in the conversation about the internet, its future, and many voices in those languages, and a lot of understanding, as the French historians of internet have told us about the Internet Imaginaries, which is a book by Patrice Fleissy. So are we bringing those in? Because there's lots of discussion, and I can't wait to read your book, about the Chinese internet and so on. But do we understand the African internets? Do we understand the Asian, very diverse Asian internets? Are those visions of the internet getting registered? Are those voices being heard? And from communications, how can we bring those to frame our discussions?
Can I take that? We're not. We're not. This conversation is mainly people from the US and Europe. No? There are a few people here from other parts of the world, but we're not. And I would argue that, the majority of, if you do the numbers, the majority of, this is a tiny part of the internet, actually, that's represented here. I don't just mean the physical people in the audience, I mean the US and Europe. Well, it's not tiny, but it's not the majority of the internet by any means. I also would say that language, whilst it is a multilingual to some extent. When was the last time you read a Chinese website or an Indian? We don't. It's actually, it fragments the internet as much as it joins people together. because you only read the things that are in languages you can understand. And generally speaking, I mean, that's the problem with the internet. It isn't just, we read all the research. I mean, I think you're one of the top people in this, Jeff. We look at the echo chambers that are out like us. That's what we look at. That's the trouble. It doesn't actually allow us to the one world aspect at all. It's not reflected in this discussion whatsoever.
Well, that's not new, is it? Right? I mean, language is always, right, since the Tower of Babel, right? Language has always divided us. I think in some ways, before the internet arose, that was somewhat invisible to those of us who didn't live in very large cities and didn't have ethnic newspapers that you could pass by and see, newspapers full of news in Chinese or Russian or other languages where the character set was different. And so I think that is one sense in which we are very obviously not one world, one network, and that we can't be, and then that's good, right? So I have a former grad student who her work is very much on preserving, Unicode-based character sets for languages that are spoken by very few people, right? And while some of us might say, well, if a language isn't widely spoken, then why should it persist? Well, those people who speak it have a very different opinion, as I learned through her work. And so, yeah, I think very much people, there are certain people who very much cling to their identity, and their identity is expressed to a large extent through their language. And so I think those folks would very much like to have their own corner of the network that gives them their distinctiveness.
We have time for one more question. Sorry. We have a hand up in the back. Give him a workout today.
It's good to see the president running.
This is the ICA 2022 fitness program going on.
Hi, sorry, that was a bit louder than I thought. Thank you for organizing this and doing the talk. So I'm one of the junior scholars in the audience that you were talking about earlier. And I really appreciated the thinking about where future research will be going to. One of the things you mentioned was identity, which is something that I am interested in myself. I'm doing research about identification, where specifically among gig workers. And I was wondering why you think this is like an important topic for future research. Why now? Because identity has been studied for a long time now. It's one of the oldest topics. Do you think something has drastically changed by now? And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
Sure, I imagine that was directed at me. So yes, identity has been studied for many years. It's quite an old topic, and I don't mean to suggest otherwise. I think what is new is that when you look at the studies of the communication discipline, and when you look at what theories and ideas and concepts have really occupied the center of the discipline, and that the people who are the most cited in the discipline have taken as their own, identity is in very short supply there. So it has always existed, but I guess what I'm calling for is a situation in which people who are at the center of the discipline cannot easily ignore research in this area, right? So, there are all sorts of, I think in any academic discipline, there have to be certain ideas that are at the center, and by definition, there have to be other ideas that are sort of relegated to the periphery. And maybe this is just my own personal opinion, but I think that identity has been on the margins for too long, and I think that this is really the moment for it to migrate from the margins to the center for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, Black Lives Matter being one, and the rise of Donald Trump, and other sort of junior authoritarians in places like Brazil and Hungary around the world. We saw the recent narrow defeat of Marine Le Pen here in France, as well as another example of that. So this is an issue that is affecting people globally in a way that I think people in the discipline at least had not been paying that much attention to. And so I think that this level of attention certainly does warrant the migration of these kinds of ideas closer to the other people may have different opinions on me on this than I do, which is totally fine. So,
I'll just say I completely agree with Dean. And I'll give you a concrete example of how I've seen my research have to change for this. So I was a covariate guy, like I would add gender and I would add race and demographics in and then run my statistics and see if they mattered at all. And usually if they didn't, I'd say good, because now I can focus on what I really care about. And what I came to realize that's wrong is that if I wanted to say study how a digital media literacy intervention would work, right? Could you get people to be better at discriminating fake from real news? And if you do that and you create something that's for older folks, that's going to be radically different than you create something for, we just did this for a community of Latinx younger people. It's not like a covariate. The program is different. The intervention is entirely different. The things that are cared about are different. The way they're targeted with different kinds of disinformation is different. And so they're separate studies. They're not even in the same paper. And it's because those identities, older individual or somebody in a Latin community, they're just completely different in a lot of really important ways. And so that's been just a huge change in the way I approach it. Very much felt like Dean has been at the forefront of for a while.
Well, I didn't know what you were talking about there.
Oh,
No.
getting people
sorry.
smarter.
It's just the point that to me, an identifier is something that is in a computer programming language and the completely different. And I don't know, are we going out to dinner? I don't know. It'd be great. We could talk more about identity there.
Sure.
But this is the cross-cultural thing that I find so fascinating is I learned so much from coming to conferences that are in a completely different world to my own. So thank you very much.
Welcome. I think we've all learned a lot. Wendy, Dean, Jeff, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thank all of you.
Thanks, Sinoshare. Thanks to Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm sorry to say that ICA is coming to a close, but we have one last celebratory thing to do. So I invite you all in the audience to join us in the gallery outside to toast the closing of an incredible ICA conference. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.